Some believers like to say there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. I've been to war. I've been shot at. I've been close to blown up. I've lost friends in war and to suicide after we came home. And I can tell you from personal experience, God dies in a lot of foxholes. I didn't grow up at all religious, but I went through the motions. Baptism, communion, confirmation, the Catholic trifecta. Most of my friends were doing the same thing at temple or in religion class. And for us, religion was a routine, a tradition, something our parents made us do. I didn't believe in God, and I didn't spend much time thinking about it. That changed after 9/11, though. Like a lot of Americans my age, I started to see religion, not just Islam, but organized religion in general, as a source of conflict. And when I deployed to Iraq in 2005, that vague discomfort turned into something harder, into anger, into hate. On one side of the wire, I had enemies whose culture and history I didn't understand. Groups who, from my perspective at the time, all seemed indistinguishable, but they hated each other as much, if not more, than they hated us. On the other side, I had my Army chaplain, an evangelical who talked about our deployment using words like crusade and a mission from God. He was a man who was supposed to provide spiritual support to everyone in the unit, regardless of their religious affiliation or lack thereof. But he seemed to see me, people like me, a non-believer, as just another heretic, no different from those that he hated outside the gates. The truth about the military that you don't see in a lot of movies is that you spend a lot of time bored. To kill time, I mostly read when I couldn't play video games. Eventually, I ran out of books and turned to the only stuff left on the shelf, the books the chaplain had provided. That's when I encountered the Left Behind series, Christian propaganda about the rapture, written for people who fantasize about watching the rest of us suffer through the apocalypse. I was halfway through one of those books when I went out on patrol one day and my platoon got ambushed. The first time that I ever experienced a complex, coordinated attack. We got out of it without a scratch, but I was shaken. I remember lying in bed after I got back to Fob Hope, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the book that I had been reading, thinking about how much destruction, how much death had been justified in the name of God. That was the moment that I became an angry atheist. For a long time, I saw religion as the problem. But over the years, I came to understand that it's not the books or the priests or the imams that create violence. It's power, it's history, it's empire. It's the boomerang effect of centuries of colonization, war, and blowback. It's identity. Years passed, and religion faded into the background of my life. But it came roaring back into focus when I saw how the American far right was using it to organize for war, a war against us. And today, the threat that I see, the domestic one that's more dangerous than anything foreign, is Christian nationalism. It wasn't until I went undercover at the Reawaken tour in 2022 that I truly started to understand how deep this goes. It was hosted by disgraced former General Mike Flynn and his grifter pal Clay Clark. Thousands of Americans packed into a theater, screaming, crying, speaking in tongues, waving flags and QAnon signs, and preparing for a so-called spiritual war. Retired U.S. military officers on stage told the crowd to stock up on precious metals, not gold or silver, but brass and lead, ammunition, for the coming purge. It's a mistake to dismiss these people as fringe lunatics. This is a well-funded movement led by former military officers, members of the Trump family, pastors, and now politicians and political appointees at the highest levels of the federal government. It's violent religious dogma with White House access. Kash Patel, now the FBI director, was confirmed by the U.S. Senate without anyone bringing up the fact that he spoke at this conference as it traveled around the country. They weren't spreading the gospel. They were preaching civil war in Jesus' name. But here's the thing. This isn't really about Christianity. Christian nationalism isn't a theology. It's an identity movement. It's a fascist ideology that borrows the language of religion to justify violence, dehumanization, and domination. It's a movement that defines who counts as a real American and who doesn't. And if we don't understand it, we can't fight it. That's why I asked Tim Whitaker to join me for this conversation. He's a believer, an evangelical who left the basement of Christian fundamentalism and now dedicates his life to exposing the machinery of Christian nationalism from inside. His platform, The New Evangelicals, is a lifeline for people trying to hold on to their faith without becoming pawns in a theocratic movement. This is On Offense. I'm Kris Goldsmith. Now let's get into it. Tim Whitaker from The New Evangelicals. Thank you so much for coming on here. Christian nationalism is a phrase that I think a lot of people have been hearing kind of as a scare word, a lot like fascism over the last few years, especially the last 10 years. I don't think a lot of people really understand what it means. Like they have a general idea, at the very surface level. But you are someone who came out of the evangelical movement, and you describe yourself as kind of having been radicalized a bit. And then you went on to create the New Evangelicals, and you've been actively working on it. So, Tim Whitaker, please let us know how you got here. What made you turn around, wake up, and go on a life mission of reclaiming faith in your own way?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Kris. It means a lot. The long story short, like anyone's story, I could be here for hours, but I won't do that. I grew up in the belly of the white conservative evangelical beast, and it's a beast. It is a well-oiled, well-organized, well-networked subculture in America. So, just a couple things I'll rattle off real quick. I was homeschooled for 9 years. I went to a small private school after that where I did graduate top 5 in my class out of 6. So that was really impressive. But that is a true story. There were 6 people in my graduating class. Did you all graduate
at the same time?
We did. I grew up in this just subculture of American culture, and was introduced to this version of Jesus very early on that essentially said, hey, you have to become a real Christian by praying this prayer, asking Christ to forgive you of your sins, so that way you won't burn in hell forever. And that was just kind of what I was formed around, that kind of idea. I did a lot of missions work. I helped plant churches. I became a pretty proficient drummer in the evangelical space because they're really well known for like their mega church culture and really top tier production in that sense. But yeah, with that culture comes the political side. So I listen to Rush Limbaugh every day. I listen to Sean Hannity, Michael Savage. I can name even Bob Grant for a little bit before he passed away. I listened to all those guys when I was working with maybe my dad on the job site, or it was just kind of in the air that I breathed. I marched for life in the pro-life rally in D.C. So, I was always a curious person, always kind of wondering what else is out there in my tradition. I was really concerned about truth, because something that you're taught often in this world is that truth matters. Truth really matters. And so I wanted to take that seriously. And also, frankly, I was radicalized to be a Jesus follower. When you're 8 years old and told, pray this prayer to Jesus and follow him lest you burn in hell forever, that's pretty good motivation. And when you're a young adult and you're a single celibate man, because you're taught to be completely celibate, you want to go on this grand adventure, and there's this notion of like Jesus will give you that, follow the way of Jesus. So I was all in. And really, I had a lot of concerns as I got older. I was kind of curious, like, why are we picking on the quote-unquote sin of being gay? Out of all the sins in the world, why are we highlighting this one? I was still conservative. At the time, I thought it was sinful, but I started seeing kind of like weird things happening where I didn't really get why we were highlighting certain things over others. And then, of course, in 2016, when Trump came along, that was really the final straw for me. And the reason why was because in evangelicalism, there's a term called purity culture. And it's just this idea that you pledge your virginity to Jesus until you get married. That's what it sounds wacky to say now, but that's just what you do. And that's what I did. My wife and I were both virgins when we got married, you know, and it's a big freaking deal. Like, sexual sin is a huge deal in the church. You can lose your position as a volunteer on the worship team. Like, it's you can be talked to by your pastors. It's a big freaking deal. And to be told that if I don't vote for the guy on the cover of Playboy, the guy who's bragging about sexually assaulting women, if I don't vote for him, I'm the heretic. I was like, wait a second, guys, we see this problem, right? Like, you taught me the importance of this so-called sexual biblical ethic, and now you're telling me that if I don't get behind a guy who seems to blow that ethic away and brags about assaulting women, somehow I'm the bad dude. And so that just led me down a deeper path. You know, I started reading more outside of my bubble. And then I just became, frankly, I became woke, I guess you could say. You know, I started understanding that American history is more complicated than the version I was taught. And then, of course, COVID happened, Black Lives Matter happened. And then in 2020, I started an Instagram account called The New Evangelicals. I had no clue what it was going to become. I was just a random dude in South Jersey, where I still live, asking questions on Instagram about church culture and, hey, is there a better path forward in faith? And that blew up online, and now we're a nonprofit. The organization is led by Melinda Hale, our executive director, and I'm the founder. And we help people find a better path forward in their faith. And that kind of got me into this whole world of Christian nationalism, long story short.
So I want to see if I can understand without being dismissive, because I'm an atheist. I've been an atheist for, I think, my whole life. Raised in the Catholic Church in Long Island, where, you know, half my friends were Jewish. So it was like, you know, for me growing up, it was like, not everybody can be right, so maybe everybody's wrong is kind of my way. So yeah. I understand the idea of fear of God. I understand the idea of burning in hell. Like this, these are the things that I was taught in the Catholic Church, at least to some extent. But when your peers, when your community came to you and really pressed you on supporting a man who's been credibly accused and has been found civilly liable in a court of law of rape, how did they respond when you said no?
Well, I mean, during 2016, that era of Trump, I was still serving in my very conservative evangelical church. And, you know, people weren't thrilled with what I was saying online. Again, there was no real social media presence. I wasn't doing this. I was just posting on my personal socials about my concern. And frankly, friends of mine always knew I was kind of picking on the evangelical church for megachurch culture. I had a lot of issues with it, but I was still committed to it. So they were definitely concerned, but I think definitely COVID was when I started TNE, that was really when that's when my church kicked me out. I started it in 2020, December, and by May of 2021, I got the ultimatum to either stop saying what I was saying online underneath the TNE banner or to stop serving as a volunteer drummer at the church. So ultimately, it cost me my entire faith community. You know, those people, after years and years of quote unquote serving together, that's insider language for you evangelicals out there, you know, they all just, most of them, you know, really left my orbit. So it was quite painful. But yeah, I mean, ultimately I went from the golden child to the wolf in the flock that had to be pushed out lest I caused young people and teenagers to stumble and become liberal or something like that.
Yeah, I know how that feels. That was the way my military career felt.
Yeah, and you understand.
Yeah. So my view on evangelical churches, on this like mega church culture, this highly produced stuff, has been limited to television. You know, half of it, like when I was a kid flipping through, you know, the 29 channels or however many there were in the 90s. Yep. And occasionally seeing this stuff on a Sunday and kind of just ignoring it. Later in life, you know, through parodies like the Righteous Gemstones. Sure. Yep. But then again, in real life, in 2022, November 2022, I decided to go on to an undercover kind of mission-ish. Like, I'm not pretending to be someone else. I just look like these people, so I blend in.
Yeah, you're what we call bro-evangelical passing.
Yeah,
you blend right in.
So I went to the Reawaken tour. It was the weekend before the 2022 elections.
I called General Flynn. I said, I feel like God wants us to team up to do a Reopen America tour, and we get people back to God. And he says, I know. I'm going, you know?
And having never been in a megachurch or an evangelical church where there's like this super high production value thing, I was shocked, not just because I was at what I thought was a political rally and it was really a religious political rally, but at the response that I saw from people in the crowd. Now, I have never seen someone speak in tongues before.
Yeah.
But I watched that happen on stage while there's disgraced former General Michael Flynn standing right there with Kash Patel, who's now the FBI director. Can you tell me about that, like, speaking in tongues thing? Where does that exist on a spectrum?
Yeah.
Like, what should people be thinking? Are people who speak in tongues inherently like QAnon adjacent? Or is that a whole other part of religion that I just have no exposure to and don't understand?
If you'll humor me, I do want to spell this out. It will take a minute, but it's really important, I think, for your audience to understand the complexity of the term evangelicalism, because it's not monolithic in a lot of ways, even though politically it is. So here's kind of how I break it down, right? If you think about Christianity as the whole thing, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, the three major wings, as a huge house, that's where we start, the house of Christianity. The wing of the Protestant Reformation, that's your Martin Luther type, right? We're talking about that wing, and now we're talking about evangelicalism. That's pretty much like one floor in the wing of Protestantism that lives in the house of Christian thought, okay? We zoom in even more, and inside of evangelicalism, you have different rooms on that floor that do not agree with each other about things, many things, including what's called the gifts of the Spirit or charismatic theology. There are two major camps in evangelicalism. You have what's called cessationists. Those are people who believe that gifts of the Spirit, like speaking in tongues or laying on of hands for miraculous healing, that kind of, maybe the caricature of the televangelist type. Cessationists believe that those gifts of the Spirit cease to happen. They do not happen anymore. It was a unique time in the Bible. They are not for today. That's your cessationists. To give you guys a Christian nationalist who would believe that, think of someone like Doug Wilson, who was featured on CNN. All right, that's your cessationist camp. Then you have your continuationists, and that's where you get into Pentecostal theology, charismatic theology, and they're going to believe that speaking in tongues is still for today, the laying on of hands, prophecy. That's where you get speaking in tongues. So we're really there's a lot of layers down that we have to dive into to kind of get to this world, even inside of evangelicalism. Now, inside of Pentecostal theology, and I'm talking, by the way, just so your audience knows, I'm talking about the American context. Globally, this is very different, but we're kind of an outlier here. Pentecostal theology or the charismatic world is divided again into denominations, like the Assemblies of God. That's the largest charismatic denomination in the world, and they have, in theory, oversight, but there's like a chain of command, that kind of thing. Then you have independent charismatics. These are your non-denominational megachurch types, although many of the churches are much smaller than that, and they operate really with full autonomy. Whoever's in charge as the pastor, whoever has been anointed by God to lead, kind of calls the shots, okay? And then inside of that world of independent charismatic churches, you have what's called the New Apostolic Reformation. And that's where you really start getting into more of the QAnon and kind of what you saw at the Reawaken America tour. I'm not saying that you can't find people who are going to believe that type of spectacle in other parts of the evangelical world. But right now, the data shows that the New Apostolic Reformation is kind of the major thrust behind this speaking in tongues, combined with the term of spiritual warfare that becomes very politicized, etc., which also, by the way, was featured at January 6th. There's a whole side of that as well.
Yeah, not that I want people to turn this episode off and go watch your podcast, but I've been listening to your podcast since we met 2 days ago, and the The things like the ram horn
Yes.
being blown
The shofar.
at January, the shofar, yeah, like that was featured on stage at this QAnon conference.
We're going to start blowing the shofar.
What was visceral was the responses from the crowd to these things. I was watching grown adults weeping.
Yeah.
And I mean hysterical when these kind of performances were happening on stage. I watched as people who were identified by disgraced former General Mike Flynn and the other organizers, Clay Clark, I think was his name, as prophets who would get up on stage and as they spoke, they were speaking the word of God, not translating. They were saying that God was speaking through their mouth.
That's right.
In that moment.
That's right.
Is that widespread in the United States, or is that like a small, tiny fringe that I just happened to be at a crazy conference?
No, when it comes to evangelicalism, the idea that God speaks to people is very common. And by the way, usually harmless. Okay, as someone who grew up in this world, I was never taught that the person on stage who told me to go storm the Capitol was speaking on behalf of God. It was more about, hey, what's the Holy Spirit telling you? How to live more Christ-like? To do your daily devotions. Very benign, just religious things that any religion has its quirks, I guess, but like that's what I was taught, So the idea that God speaks to the individual is pretty common theology in evangelicalism. Now, again, charismatic theology, and in particular the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, that's where you're going to get into this world of the person on the stage is prophesying, that's the term that they use, by speaking on behalf of God, by declaring certain things. For those of you out there who might have remembered the 2020 election or the current fraud or the fraud allegations, if you ever seen some of the videos of Paul the White going viral where she's speaking in tongues and she's declaring angels from Africa, that's the prophecy side that we're talking about here, okay? These are people who believe, and I don't, it's important for me to always humanize other human beings, even though they have beliefs that I think are really out there, right? But these are people who are, many of which are sincere, but they truly do believe that they are in a spiritual battle versus good versus evil, that there's a demonic that is real, that has infected certain parts of America, including the Democratic Party, and that they have an obligation and a God-given mandate to wage war in the spirit against those people. And that comes in the form of speaking in tongues, it comes in the form of worship music, it comes in the form of prophecy. And these leaders, these so-called apostles, are kind of seen as they're not seen as superheroes, they're seen as having a unique anointing, that's the term, to be able to speak on behalf of the heart of God and what he is saying to the congregants to do.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it works.
Can you help me understand? So you've described about how some of these prophets are anointed, and they are people who are ostensibly living the life of the church. How is it that Donald Trump became anointed? Even though there's zero aspect of his life that reflects any of those values.
Yes.
Is it just a naked play for power? Is it that simplistic, or is there something deeply psychological that makes it so that the contradiction is completely pushed out of people's heads?
So there are different roads depending on what room in the evangelical floor that you're on of how you kind of get there. Let's talk about the charismatic prophetic side, right? Because it's really important. First off, the NAR is born in the 90s by a guy named C. Peter Wagner. He essentially says, hey, the apostles in the Bible, there's a new age of the apostles coming our way. We're going to change the church structure it's as important as the Reformation. So he's the one who kind of gets this network of apostles and prophets kind of off the ground. It's really seen as fringe, even in evangelicalism, for a long time. That's really important for the audience to know. This isn't like some massive, explosion in the 90s or early 2000s. They're kind of seen as like, the weird uncle that you see at Christmas. Like, okay, good to see you. Don't want to see you again, right? So how does this fringe group go from becoming one of the fastest growing sects of Christianity today in America? Well, Donald Trump's spiritual advisor and mentor before all of this, before he ran for office, was Paula White. Paula White is the key to how Trump not only runs for office, but also how he gets the charismatic vote or the push behind it. Paula White is a megachurch, kind of prosperity gospel person, deeply tied to the New Apostolic Reformation. And essentially, Trump wanted to run in 2012. And by the way, I'm citing Matthew Taylor's book here, The Violent Take It by Force, a great deep dive on this. And Paula White says, no, you shouldn't run this time. And he decides to run in 2016. She says, great, I support that. And then she invites a lot of her charismatic leaders and pastor friends to Trump Tower in New York City to kind of have a meet and greet, so to speak. And this is where they start kind of getting, okay, yeah, like this guy will essentially give us what we want, right? More religious freedom. And by the way, these are all false claims, right? That we're under attack and whatever. But they think, okay, we'll get more religious freedom. He'll give us access to the White House potentially to make America a Christian nation again. And so the question, of course, and this is before the tape comes out, but the question, of course, becomes how do we make a billionaire, playboy who is not Christian kind of like the dude? And so at this point, you have to understand that, especially in independent charismatic spaces, whatever these apostles say about the Bible or about what God is saying goes. So if they get a word from God that God has chosen Trump, they're going to create theological justifications to convince their audience why this is what's happening. And I'm not sure if you'll have time before this airs, but you should pull some of the clips of these so-called prophets prophesying why Trump is called by God to lead us through, this dark age of American society. Someone by the name of Lance Wallnau, a key player in all of this, creates this term this theology that Trump is a modern day Cyrus, because in the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus wasn't a Jewish person, but still liberated the Israelites.
I'm just giving you the pattern. You can talk to God about why he did it, but I'm going to tell you, this is the pattern. So you start with an outsider like this. Anyway, so the Cyrus Trump comes along, and then he goes, and in the 70-year anniversary, he moves the embassy to Jerusalem.
So Trump isn't a Christian, right, but is going to liberate us Christians. Now, of course, it's terrible biblical interpretation, but it works, especially when God has given you this image of what Trump is. So you have to understand that the culture that they're speaking into, the congregations see the authority structure, believe that these men and women are anointed by God. We dare not go against God's anointed. And so if they're giving us these prophetic words from the mouth of God himself to us, we should definitely believe it. Plus, that world's right-wing anyway. White evangelicals have overwhelmingly voted Republican, so it was no shocker that they would get behind Trump on top of the justification for the theology.
Mm-hmm. Now, the NAR, the National, the New Apostolic Reformation.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Is that the church that Pete Hegseth is affiliated with?
No, this is a different floor in evangelicalism. Okay, this is where we get back to your cessationists, people who don't believe that speaking in tongues is for today. This is a very broad term is reformed. Okay, it's a very broad term, but there's this is the reformed side, a different floor, different wing, or a different room set completely. And so Pete Hegseth is coming out of, even in that world, kind of what was a fringe sect, but now very powerful. Doug Wilson is the person who started this denomination of churches. CREC is the acronym. Forgot what it stands for. But essentially, Doug Wilson went mega viral. He was interviewed by CNN maybe a year ago now, a few months ago. And he's someone who openly states that we should repeal the 19th Amendment. He thinks that women are to make babies and make sandwiches. He has a very patriarchal, misogynistic, racist, homophobic view of the world.
Women are the kind of people that people come out of.
So you just think they're meant to have babies? That's it. They're just a vessel.
No, it doesn't take any talent to simply reproduce biologically. The wife and mother, who is the chief executive of the home, is entrusted with 3 or 4 or 5 eternal souls.
And he is being inspired, and I know this is a deep well, but it's so key to understand this because what we're experiencing is not new. Okay, there's a huge tradition that's been underneath all of this for a very long time. He leans into a term called theonomy or dominionism. Okay, and this is the idea that biblical law, of course, their interpretation of what the Bible says, biblical law should supersede and replace American law. Yes. Okay, this is where you're going to get the, hey, the Bible says that we should stone gay people. Maybe we should bring some of those things back, or that, hey, maybe slavery isn't that bad because it's in the Bible. So they're never going to say, oh, hey, the Bible talks about economic justice for the poor. No, those verses don't count. It's always going to reinforce those things. And so Doug Wilson runs a series of churches. Pete Hegseth was discipled by Doug Wilson and that ilk. He comes to his church. His pastor's name is Kris Goldsmith, and he just planted a church in Washington, D.C., so Pete Hegseth can attend church there. So, and I told you this when we were live on the Find Out podcast, but one of my big gripes with the confirmation hearing of Pete Hegseth is that not one politician, including Democrats, brought up Pete Hegseth's discipleship of an extremist. I mean, literally a man, and I've interviewed him, so I know this, who told me that he wants Christ is Lord in our Constitution before he dies. That's the theology Pete Hegseth is inhaling and is reflecting now in the Department of War.
Do you believe that people like Pete Hegseth are true believers in this religion, or do they see it as a function of power?
It's probably mixed. I don't know. Look, one of the reasons, and again, you probably know more about this than I do, but one of the reasons why religion can be very attractive for people who maybe have hit rock bottom is that it gives them meaning, it gives them a path, it gives them some kind of greater sense of purpose, right? Again, can be very healthy. Healthy religiosity has great mental health outcomes, and that's objective secular data, okay? We're not talking about the healthy side. This is the dark side. But someone like Pete Hegseth, who has a history of being abusive and alcoholism, might have really found God in this form to give him something bigger than himself. That's totally possible. Doug Wilson, I would say for sure, is someone who believes what he is preaching. And because he's been around for like 30-something years in this space. I mean, way before he hit national news. So I think a lot of these church leaders, for sure, are really bought in, but there definitely is opportunity for a lot of grifting. No doubt about that, So I wouldn't be surprised if someone like Pete Hegseth is just grifting this. But from my experience, both being in that evangelical world and what I know about the level of fervor that you have for these beliefs, I would say they're definitely genuine. And then the proof that God is blessing what you believe is your success and access to power.
Okay. So that sounds very much like Mike Johnson.
Mike Johnson is a dyed-in-the-wool Christian nationalist who literally believes he's the second coming of Moses, okay, to lead his Christians out of exile. He's tapped into NAR people. In fact, the Appeal to Heaven flag, which was featured on January 6th, huge NAR symbol, he has that flag outside of his office. So yes, Mike Johnson, I think, is no grifter. I think he's the real deal.
I have so many questions, and I'm trying not to make this interview just absolute chaos because my brain is chaos right now.
I get it, man.
I'm thinking about so many things.
Look, I'm usually in your position. I host a show too. I host 2 of them actually, so I understand. You're like, where do we even start with this complicated world? I get it.
Yeah, and it's because I'm an expert in extremist movements and extremists, but religiosity is something that I think because of my personal bias of atheism, of frankly, like a large part of my life, I was just anti-religious. Like
Sure.
when I went to war, I blamed religion. Like that was the first thing that I blamed. Having not really had any religious inclination at all going over there, like I wasn't invested. But once I was there, I was just like, this is all religion. All of the world's problems are religion, right?
Yeah.
I'm a more complicated, educated person now. I still don't believe in an angry sky god, but I appreciate people who do. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way, because what you said before about the secular data on healthy religiosity is important. It is undeniable that people who have, especially in a time that is this turbulent and feels this dangerous, being moored to something that feels bigger than yourself, if it's a healthy thing, can save you in so many ways, right? For other people, it's the 12-step program.
Totally.
Right. And that is, to each their own. Like, I also used to hate that thing, but now I understand like why people do it and why it's good for some folks. This is a completely unrelated idea that is just stuck in my head, is how do all of these religious extremists, whether it is Mike Johnson or Pete Hegseth or Mike Huckabee,
Yep.
what do they think about Israel?
Yeah.
Can you tell us?
I can.
Why?
I definitely can.
Just give us like the I don't know, 30,000 foot, because
Yeah.
I know it's complicated.
Yeah.
But can you explain why these people who seem to be so fucking bigoted all the time, like have a special place for Israel?
To prove that I'm a edgy Christian, I'll say, I'll fucking tell you why. See, guys? See, I'm cool and hip like everyone else out there, you know? I'll give you the easy 30,000 foot view. Because they believe that that Israel in the Bible is the Israel of the nation of Israel. And God says in the Bible that whoever blesses Israel will be blessed, whoever curses Israel will be cursed. And so as a Christian nation, if we want to stay blessed and under the good hand of God, we have to always bless Israel, which means supporting Israel no matter what. And secondly, there is an end times theology to this. I will not go into the weeds; it gets complicated. But the general thought among many evangelicals is that God needs Israel to be a nation for Him to come back, and the more that happens, the closer we are to the return of Christ. And Israel plays a key role in that. So those are the two major theological drivers that convince many evangelicals to blindly support the nation state of Israel, no matter what it does or what genocide it commits.
Can you help me understand, are these people pushing for the end times? And in their logic, are they denying their children or future generations life, envisioning that the future of humanity is in heaven after God returns to Israel?
Yeah.
I know that this might seem like a super fucking far off thing, but like I am so curious about the motivations, because like wars can start over these beliefs, and
for sure.
And, yeah. So
have you ever heard of the Left Behind series, The Rapture?
My crusader fucking chaplain, when I was in Iraq, that was the only books that he put on the fucking shelf, and man, can I tell you how angry I was. That's probably why I hated religion.
I'm with you. In fact, in my spaces, a lot of ex-evangelicals have serious anxiety still about the end of the world, because we were introduced to this idea called the rapture, where at any moment we're going to get sucked up to heaven naked because our clothes will stay back here, or we're left behind and it turns out we weren't really Christian and the whole world goes to shit. So, okay, look, again, I want to emphasize over and over, it's never monolithic. It's not every evangelical has all these views. It's complicated. There are two major schools of thought, and I'm really boiling it down here. Either the world gets better and better until the return of Christ and God's kingdom comes to earth. So that's one way of thinking about it. Or the world gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until Christ comes back and judges the living and the dead and fixes all the problems, etc. And that ties into how people support Israel. It also has to do with, it's funny, you're right in what you said. When you really think about these things logically, these beliefs, you're saying, wait, so you want more wars to happen? Because that's the belief. Many evangelicals, many Zionists, many charismatics and Reformed believe that things will get worse and worse. That means that we're in the last days. And so some of them get giddy about that shit. And you go, wait a second, those wars are costing human lives. the same humans that you taught me in my Sunday school as a kid are made in the image of God, right? I mean, look at what's happening in Palestine, right? Why do you think America has this view? Well, theology is a huge part of it, and the Palestinians are expendable for the greater good. Which, if you're an evangelical and you believe that anyone who isn't a true Christian or Christian burns in hell forever, essentially these people are just sending Palestinians to burn in hell forever. Right? But somehow they serve a loving and just God. So the logic falls apart. The other thing I'll say about this, and I say this often, in my opinion, Christian Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic because many evangelicals believe that either the Jews will either convert to Christianity and know the true Messiah, or they will be slaughtered.
In the wake of the October 7th attacks, I had previous commitments where I was speaking at JCRCs, the Jewish Community Centers, and I mean like in the days and weeks following October 7th, and I had to explain this concept to groups of both secular and deeply religious Jews who had just experienced a rough equivalent to 9/11,
right.
saying this is a New Yorker and a New Jerseyan. Like it is deeply, deeply personal what happened.
100%.
And I think that there is from my experience in speaking to these well-intentioned, generally progressive audiences, that they truly do not understand this concept, or it is so foreign to them, at least the folks that I've interacted with personally. I'm not speaking nationwide. It seemed like the concept was so foreign to them that if they had heard this explanation before, they erased it from memory. It seemed as if I was the first one ever to broach this subject about how these people are not your allies. They are anti-Semitic. Their support for Israel is based in their anti-Semitism. They believe that you are either demonic or you are going to convert to their religion. And these folks, and again, this is a very fucking sensitive time to be talking about anything. Right?
Of course.
And these folks didn't know how to respond. Like, they thought, I think, that I was lying because it sounded so fucking absurd. Is that the response that you get from folks when you're talking in like interfaith audiences? Yeah,
I mean, when I tell anyone who didn't grow up evangelical this stuff, they go, you're lying, or this sounds like conspiracy. Again, when I tell them that people believe that Jewish people either will burn in hell forever or convert to Christianity, and that we have to usher in the end times, people go, no one believes that. And then I point to the Left Behind series, which sold millions and millions of copies and spawned like 3 different movie franchises. And I go, no, they do. Like, people believe this stuff. And I was taught this stuff as a young adult.
Welcome aboard PanCon Flight 257 to London. Flight time today will be 6 hours and 30 minutes.
I love you.
People from all over this plane have simply vanished.
Kris, let me in! Kris!
So yeah, I definitely get looks of like, what? And that's why I'm so passionate about this work, about exposing Christian nationalism, because the average American just has no freaking idea the level of Christian supremacy and zealotry that they're dealing with here, right? I wanted to add to what you just said, but the thought is escaping me at the moment. It was regarding, so just to prove it is. Look, I'm not saying anti-Semitism cannot exist in left-wing spaces or any of that. Of course, it can exist anywhere. But it really is wild watching Christian nationalists try and point the finger at the left when they got people like Nick Fuentes rising the ranks, or Joel Webbin, right, advocating for how Hitler was cool and great. But I also want to add that it was baked into the pie long ago. So Franklin Graham's dad, Billy Graham, one of the greatest, most famous, evangelists of all time, he was caught on a hot tape with Nixon talking about how there are good Jews and how there are bad Jews, and how bad Jews come from the synagogue of Satan. That is classic Christian anti-Semitism. Like it's conspiracy, etc. So this runs deep in the psyche of evangelicals and is growing. So it is kind of a paradox. On one hand, they want to support Israel, and Netanyahu knows why they do this, but he'll take it, right? I mean, please give us all the bombs that we can fire off. So he doesn't give a shit. And so you have this one side that's like protect Israel, and the other side that's like, but I think the Jews might be kind of running the banks and running the media. And maybe Nick is kind of right. Like maybe the Holocaust was kind of exaggerated. So it's really interesting watching these two worlds collide.
Mm-hmm. Do you see a figure like Nick Fuentes, who 5 years ago, if I said his name, most people wouldn't know who he was? He was an organizer behind January 6th and, rode around with people like Alex Jones from InfoWars, meeting with the Oath Keepers in Georgia. At the time, I was infiltrating the 3% security force in Georgia and like capturing stuff from inside. Is Fuentes a believer, or for him is this a power play? Because this is his version is Catholicism.
Yep.
And what is there a conflict at all right now between this new rise of these fascist Catholics and evangelicals, or are they kind of ignoring each other, doing their own thing?
First off, Kris, it's so funny that you and I were doing very similar things even 5 years ago, but from totally different vantage points. I mean, I wasn't infiltrating things on the ground, but I remember when Nick Fuentes spoke, when MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene, spoke at Nick Fuentes' event, and I went, God, is anyone seeing this? Like, is anyone seeing what is happening? Like, this is I mean, I was like, my jaw dropped that a sitting congresswoman was speaking at a Nick Fuentes event in support and then defending it, doubling down, right? And so I'm with you where I saw Nick from afar and went, it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter because you see the trajectory. I mean, you can look back. We weren't talking about repealing the 19th Amendment even 4 years ago, 3 years ago. The Proud Boys were not a household name a decade ago. So you and I know where this is heading, right? To answer your question, Nick is Catholic, at least he claims to be. I don't know how serious he takes his faith. But the real rift is Jews. Are the Jews right now. So, and again, this is fresh off the press recently. So that Tucker Carlson spoke at America Fest, Turning Point America Fest. Well, a lot of charismatic pastors, boycotted going to the event because they were thinking, why is Tucker Carlson being platformed here when he just interviewed Nick Fuentes, who said things like Hitler was great and was anti-Semitic? So for the charismatics in particular, they are very much like, no, we don't like Nick. Nick is a bad person. And I go, hey, I agree. We can high five on that. I'll find the common ground. So there is a rift along the issue of Israel for sure. But regarding eschatology or like theology, no, they will easily look past that to shake hands. And I'll just say, this is why I'm so loud about Turning Point USA and have been for several years, because they have Turning Point Faith. This is their faith arm. And they're working feverishly to bring people who would not see eye to eye theologically, your charismatics and your non-charismatics, to work together politically. So that definitely is a major thing that's happened over the past 5 to 6 years. So they're not really that concerned about those things, even though they claim to be. They'll work with the heretics when it's politically convenient. But the major issue right now is Israel. That's the real dividing line.
Can you describe for me the evolution of evangelicals and the way that they view immigrants over your lifetime? Growing up in the Catholic Church, immigrants, no matter how you got here, were cared for by the church. And now my native Long Island, where it seemed when I grew up, you were either Catholic, and that meant you were Irish or Italian, or you were Jewish. Like that seemed to be pretty universal, of like welcoming immigrants, doesn't matter how they got here. Was the evangelical church like that in the 90s?
Dude, I remember Sean Hannity every day, the border, the illegals. Look, I will tell you this, and I take my word as just experiential here. I don't have data to back this up. I did not hear much from the pulpit about immigration, okay, as a kid. I can't think of one time where a pastor railed against the immigrants. But the political stuff I inhaled was certainly typical right-wing Fox News Rush Limbaugh talking points, you know? But I will say what has been interesting to me, and again, you know, it's funny how you and I are doing a lot of the same work in different spaces, but I go to America Fest every year. I've been there 3 years in a row. You know, I get a badge, they know who I am, they're cool with me going, and I circle that media floor 10 hours a day, just trying, you're trying to soak in the culture, right? Trying to get it in on your clothes. And I remember, what was it, 3 years ago, I'm listening to Charlie Kirk, and he's talking about things like the Great Replacement Theory. And I went, wait a second. I know that term because I've been reading history lately, and that comes from the KKK. What the hell are we doing repeating KKK talking points about the Great Replacement? So in my experience, I've certainly seen an uptick of the extremism. Of course, Trump, only made it worse. So I would say it was always an issue, but not maybe the issue. I think abortion, it still kind of is the issue, but was more in the front, or maybe gay marriage. But yeah, I mean, anti-immigrant, especially anti-brown-skinned immigrant sentiments, we're always there, right? We're always there. But definitely, I think over the past decade, we've seen a real rise in the repeating of talking points that we can trace back to legitimate white supremacist movements.
How are now? I'm not talking about the evangelical radicals, the that we're talking about, like the inherently fascistic ones. I would like your view into the broader evangelical community. In the broadest sense, is there a revulsion of the violence that they're seeing ICE using on the streets today, or has culturally the politics side of evangelicalism started to erase the empathy that they might have otherwise felt when they see people getting tackled and chased into basements and having their places of work raided? Does the broader evangelical, and I'm asking as someone who's totally fucking ignorant of this, so I know it's a big and loaded question, is the broader evangelical Christian community looking at this as an aberration, as something that is offensive, or has the othering of immigrants become so immersed into their politics that they're not seeing these events from the religious angle at all?
I'm going to give you just data. I follow the data. The data is important. Before I do, let me just give you this piece that's important to know. White evangelicalism is built on the other. There's always an other. The gays, the Marxists, the liberals, the immigrant, the trans person. There's always an other. Essentially, I grew up in a basement with no windows, no light coming through, and the gatekeepers interpreted anything from the outside to me. There was always a mediator, right? So I'm just taught that the world out there is scary and wants to destroy me, and I have to stay in here for protection. So the whole evangelical structure is built around fear, like so much fear about everything, especially other people groups that you believe are sinful or abominations or satanic. I mean, in the 80s, there was the satanic panic. There's always a new boogeyman, all right? So keep that in mind. It's not just immigrants. It could be anyone at any given time. Remember the whole critical race theory scare a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
That's all of a sudden, no one's talking about that. Now it's the immigrant, right? Okay, so here's the data. I'm citing here PRRI. They're one of the biggest data firms tracking Christian nationalism, very trustworthy. The data, first off, regarding voting, 80% of white evangelicals have voted for Trump every single election since he's been on the ballot, including this past one, including when Trump was calling immigrants poison to the blood of society and promising mass deportation. So let's just start there, okay? White evangelicals knew what they were voting for. Trump was very clear. Data came out, I think, in September of last year, polling people to see how do you approve or disapprove of the job that Trump is doing. Now, at this point, ICE raids are happening. Okay, at this point, we're seeing the footage. 77% of white evangelicals approved of the job Trump was doing in his first year or 100 or so days in office. Okay. And now there's new data that just dropped. I just shared it on my Threads account a second ago. I'm going to read it I'm going to read it real quick just so you understand. So, right now, 4 in 10 Americans favor stripping U.S. citizens of their citizenship and deporting them if they are determined to be a threat to the country. Okay? White evangelical Protestants, 56%, are the only religious group with majority support for stripping U.S. citizens of their citizenship and deporting them. They're the only religious group that's in the majority. So I think that data speaks for itself. And I will say this. You asked, are there people on the inside maybe trying to push back against this? This system pushes those people out. Russell Moore, maybe a name you know or don't know, was the ethics president of the Southern Baptist Convention, the biggest evangelical conglomerate in the world, okay? He is a conservative. He's like a Mitt Romney conservative. And when Trump came on the scene, he said, no, I'm not voting for Trump. He is now seen as a woke leftist liberal heretic and is maligned daily on Twitter by people like Megan Basham or William Wolf, who are pushing the SBC farther and farther to the right. So there was even no room for even Mitt Romney type conservatives. Russell Moore is out. So the system is designed to push people who are seen as a threat out, not to reform. So in my opinion, and I say this as someone who is sad to say it, I don't take joy in saying this, but as a product of the white evangelical church and as someone who spent the past 5 years understanding its history, in my opinion, there is nothing redeemable about white evangelicalism. It is built on white supremacy. It's built on nationalism. It's built on hatred of the other. It's irredeemable as far as I'm concerned.
You know, I'm glad that you brought up before when we were talking about Nick Fuentes, Charlie Kirk, because there is no one who benefited more from Charlie Kirk's death than Nick Fuentes.
Definitely.
They had been, for people who don't follow this stuff closely, they had been, because of Nick, like he chose Charlie Kirk as a target and as a foil. They have been arch enemies. And I watched Nick Fuentes over the last few years radicalizing young Republicans, young MAGA men primarily, to the point that Charlie Kirk had no choice but to go from explicitly calling out the Great Replacement conspiracy theory as an anti-Semitic and racist conspiracy theory. And he did this on his own podcast and called out Nick Fuentes specifically, to watching just a couple years later, Charlie Kirk naming the Great Replacement as a fact, not as a conspiracy theory, as something that he was supporting and that he was helping to spread. How is it that you think that people outside of the political sphere who may not be immersed in the evangelical church, but it's kind of like the culture that exists, how do you think that these forces have been affecting them? Do you think the radicalization is coming from within the church, from these apostles? Do you think it's getting several points away from the churchgoer, or is the threat of the radicalization involved in Christian nationalism, is it limited to church going?
It's like throwing a rock in a pond and seeing the ripples and how far they go. You don't have to know where the source came from. You just know that something moved you. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, people underestimate the influence and power of the white evangelical infrastructure. And I think absolutely it's reaching people who have no clue what it is. I mean, think about Charlie Kirk's funeral, right? I'm not sure if you saw, but in the beginning they had these worship music artists, leading worship at Charlie's funeral. Many of them topped the secular Billboard charts. Brandon Lake is he's a superstar, period. He's not just a Christian artist anymore. Well, those people were also featured at an event called Passion, which is a humongous young adult event, 45,000 people in Texas, and they led worship there. right? So like people don't understand all the cross-pollination that's going on. The same people leading worship to all these young adults, not being political, are the same people leading worship at Charlie Kirk's funeral, essentially giving their audience the sign of God's approval on this funeral of a man who said that black women don't have the brain power and are stealing the jobs of white women, right? So yeah, I would say there's definitely an influence happening.
A lot of people think that this is a fringe ideology. And I think I might be guilty. I am guilty of using the word fringe to talk about these kinds of Christian nationalist extremists. Do you think that fringe is still the word to use because they've achieved so much power? I think that I have difficulty figuring out if I am confusing power with numbers and size, or if the power is reflective of the numbers and size of the movement.
Okay, I'm glad you brought this up. I'm actually looking at my other screen here because I have a whole article pulled up about this and how they measure Christian nationalism. I'm going to just read you some basic data. First off, look, if you're looking at numbers only, it's fringe. It's fringe. About 3 in 10 Americans hold some form of Christian nationalist ideology. 3 in 10. That's not very. I mean, it's a third. It's decent, but it's not like it's not what everyone's believing. If you go into the NAR, even more fringe. If you go into like Doug Wilson's world, even more fringe. So for sure, numerically fringe. But like you said, it's not about the numbers. It's about the access to power. Right? One man is in the Oval Office. Look at all the shit he's doing. Right? That's one person. So the data works like this. PRI did a whole study. They always do a study on this. They break up Christian nationalism into different quadrants. You can be a Christian nationalist adherent. You can be a sympathizer. You can be a skeptic, or you can be a rejecter. And they measure it by giving people 5 statements, like America was founded as a Christian country. If Christianity ceases to be, America won't be a nation anymore. Things like that. Okay, there's 5 of these statements. You can look it up, prri.org, for all of you out there who want my sourcing on this. They found in their research about 15% of polling showed that they were Christian nationalist adherents. That's your Charlie Kirk type. That's your, Doug Wilson type. Another 15% are sympathizers. So they might hold agreement on 1 to 3 of those statements to some degree, but they're not going to storm the Capitol building over it. And then you have the rest being a combination of skeptics and rejectors. About 60% is what it comes out to. So yeah, it definitely is. But the difference is that the rejectors and skeptics are much more divided. They are not monolithic. They are not thinking about life in terms of everything being a battle or a spiritual battle. They don't think that there's some deep state trying to take over America, so they have to take back the country. So there is a difference in terms of effort and of power. And when it comes to power, Christian nationalists overwhelmingly hold political power. Not even a question. I mean, Paula White is the director of the faith office in the White House, bringing all of her apostle friends to literally, and I mean this sincerely, to pray over the White House to cleanse it of the demonic. You have to understand one more thing I need to mention. In particular, the NAR, they believe that demonic forces can manifest in physical places, usually in high Muslim populations, high Democratic populations, queer, etc. In fact, Peter Wagner and his team did a trip to Mount Everest once. They tried to get up there to pray over what they thought was like a demonic stronghold to free it, because they have power in the spirit. So for these folks, they'll use terms like territory. We're taking territory for the kingdom. So when they see Paula White in the White House, to them, that's a symbol to the demonic forces out there that they have conquered and that they're in control of the White House, aka God is. So this is for them all warfare language.
Can you expand more on the demonic thing? Like how literal that is, that it's not just like a throwaway word?
Yeah. It's quite literal. Look, in the Bible, first off, the Bible is an ancient collection of texts from a whole different way of seeing the world, right? In fact, there's much beauty to it. But there's a world for the ancient Hebrews and authors of, a spiritual world, a world that is not this world, that is affected by this world. So there's definitely biblical precedent for the idea of angels, demons, etc. And again, usually benign stuff for most Christians. In this case, though, these folks believe that you can be possessed by a demon, that you can actually have a demonic presence over you. In fact, there are videos that go viral of these preachers casting out demons out of people on the street, and they're like convulsing. To them, that's very real. They believe that the demonic is influencing how people vote. It's influencing transgender people. It's influencing queer people. I mean, they really believe that some people believe, not all, that if you're depressed, you don't need therapy. You need deliverance. You need to be prayed over. You need a demon cast out of you. You need that demon of depression cast out of you. And so these are people who would not jump to a therapist, let alone a secular therapist, let alone medication. No, you have to pray more in the spirit. So that absolutely is a huge part. And to tie this together, January 6th, the prophets prophesied that Trump won the election, okay, because God told them. And so therefore there must be a demonic force, a demonic presence that is stopping this reality from manifesting. And so we have to war in the spirit. We have to pray against the evil forces of darkness, including going to the Capitol to pray and to lead worship. Look up the name Cindy Jacobs. She was there with her team from afar, praying, reciting like a verse from Proverbs, praying the Lord's Prayer, all declaring that, demonic forces need to go.
We need to learn to oppose what Satan is doing. Many times people are very passive in their life, but this is a time for warfare. This is a time, the analogy given to us is that we are like a warrior. We have combat boots on. We're ready for war, even when we're getting married.
So this is very real for these people.
Who is Cindy Johnson?
Cindy Jacobs is one of the key players in the New Apostolic Reformation. She was mentored by C. Peter Wagner, who's now deceased. So she's a major player in that world.
Cindy Jacobs.
Yep, Cindy Jacobs.
One of the things, and I'm just, as you're speaking, my brain is going back to that QAnon conference where the difference between seeing this stuff, even like documentaries, like, not making fun of these people, documentary films, showing these hyper-religious stuff where they're laying hands, they're speaking in tongues. Being physically present for that was, I don't have a better word than I already said. Like, it was just a visceral experience. I could feel it in my body, like the discomfort of being in a room. I mean, undercover with 6,000 people who, if they knew who I was, would be very upset with me being in the rooms.
Right.
That was probably part of it. But, I would watch, again, Flynn and Clay Clark leading this thing, getting up on stage, and during these like set changeovers, when they'd have, go from a musician to a presentation or whatever, Clay Clark would get up on stage and he'd be like, here's a slideshow. And he would take apart words and transfer them into numbers and then do some math on screen, and everything would equal 666.
Yeah, classic.
And he would go to Flynn, who, carries the credibility of his former rank, of his former station. He worked for Obama, right? Like he didn't always work for Trump. He was still in the military when he worked for Obama. But can you explain this idea of numerology in religion, and why is it that any equation, any sentence can be turned into an equation that equals 666 and therefore is evil?
Yeah, there's definitely infighting here, and not every evangelical is going to adhere to this kind of stuff. But I will say a common theme that is baked into the evangelical psyche is the fear of the demonic and of satanic. Satan. This, Satan being everywhere. It's Pokemon cards, it's Harry Potter, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so you have to understand that in the 80s, there was a major push. It was called Satanic Panic. Jerry Falwell, the founder of Liberty University, also the founder of the Moral Majority, kind of helped push this. So all this is in the background. And I also want to add, this is kind of insider baseball, but the interpretations that they use are horrific. There's a reason why real biblical scholarship never promotes this stuff. Like any critical biblical scholar who's given their life to understanding the Bible will tell you it's bullshit. This is bullshit, terrible interpretations that are not accurate or reflective of what the Bible is actually saying. But essentially, they believe that in the book of Revelation, the number 666 is a sign of the beast, which is a sign of Satan. The end of the world. Okay, what side are you on? God's side or Satan's side? So this world will look for symbols or ways to justify why what they think is the enemy is satanic by doing this. I mean, there's an old video of a woman who takes a Monster can, the energy drink, and walks through why it's satanic. Again, if you guys can find it, you should play it. It's hilarious. But she walks through how this symbol means this, and this means this, and therefore 666, and therefore Monster, and that company is a satanic company that Christians should avoid. So it's really just an elaborate way of controlling the masses, right? It's a powerful way of controlling people and dictating what they can and can't listen to. There's videos from back in the 80s of people playing Led Zeppelin backwards and saying, look, do you hear it? Do you hear Satan? Do you hear it? They were satanic. I mean, I was taught that as a kid. I was taught that AC/DC stood for Antichrist, Devil's Child. Yeah, I know. You should laugh at that. I hope everyone's laughing at that. But they will just look for it, right? They will read into situations what they want to read to justify why that's bad and this is good.
Yeah. So have you ever seen the I used to call it a documentary because that's the way it's branded, but that's not what it is. Have you ever seen the movie Zeitgeist?
I have not.
Okay. So I had... my flirting with religion, the closest thing that I've come to religion was this idea of like adherence to the Constitution. I lacked a religion, and I needed something, especially at that point in my life. Got out of the military, and it was like made all these sacrifices. Didn't understand the sunk cost fallacy yet. Thank you, school. A few years later, but I was like, I have to stay invested in this thing.
Sure.
And I watched this movie Zeitgeist, which did that trick where it was like drawing on a board like Glenn Beck back in the day, where it's like, if this is that, then this is that, and like showing the logical argument as if it's logical when it is in no way, because I didn't understand logical arguments back then or critical thinking.
Yes.
I understand becoming a radicalized, I don't know, evangelical is the only word I can think of right now. Like evangelizing about the war for Iraq the war in Iraq being part of something bigger.
Yep.
I watched that documentary for curiosity's sake because it like stuck in my brain, and I was so obsessed with it for like a couple of years from like 2007 to 2009. It was on my brain a lot. And I went back and realized, a lot of the symbolism that I'm seeing here is deeply fucking anti-Semitic. And it's like, it's not telling you it's the Jews who control the banks or control, create incentives for warfare and all this shit. So I think that people who are listening to this and hear my skepticism and disgust towards these people who are so radicalized, I think they should understand that this comes from a place of, I don't know if self-loathing is too intense, but like I am angry at myself for being so vulnerable to those types of conspiracy theories. The early age of YouTube, I mean, today's YouTube is flooded with it still, but the early days of YouTube when I was unemployable because I was a fucking mess and I was spending a lot of time on the internet, it was filled with stuff like that. Yeah. It was filled with this radicalizing content where things were presented as a revelation that you were going to make. Right. It would draw the lines for you. It would connect the dots for you and then ask you, hey, what is this a picture of at the end?
Exactly.
And that, I guess I have like a little bit of sympathy for people who are surrounded by this, because I had this time in my life where I was so impressionable and having those like eureka moments where I'm seeing the patterns that other people are not seeing. I felt like I had this secret knowledge. I felt like that secret knowledge made me, it is what drove me to become an evangelist for literally buying. I was like dead fucking broke, bought a bunch of DVD burners because they used to go slow as hell. And that's how you used to duplicate data
Back in
physically.
The day.
I was burning copies of that fucking movie and dropping it in people's mailboxes because I felt such intensity of like, I need to wake people up. So
I get it.
You know, people who are listening to me and everything that I've ever fucking said about religion on social media should know that there is that background where like it wasn't religion,
right?
But it was something like it.
Yes.
And I think that it's hard for a lot of people to see that in themselves. I think it's like it's more widespread than anyone really talks about.
Yeah.
The need for some sort of central core belief, belonging, community, all of these things that religion and many other things can, but religion does bring you.
Yeah.
How is it that you had your awakening where you started to feel like this community isn't right for me, and you left, or well, you were pushed out of your church, but you didn't lose your religion?
So you said a lot of good things I think are actually really important for your audience. I'm assuming most of them are more secular, more progressive. And look, we have to be honest. We could be a little snobbish sometimes. Oh, those stupid idiots. How do they believe? No. We're human. Humans can do things, okay? People get scammed who think that they're above being scammed, right? There is a human psychology to belonging and to wanting meaning. And frankly, like you just pointed out, we've all had beliefs at one time or another where we can look back and go, yeah, that wasn't really a wise way of thinking, but it was so convincing at the time. I used to walk around my town praying for the kingdom of God to manifest on earth. I was convinced I had a secret knowledge about God's kingdom and everything. And by the way, I would argue that as a Christian, I still believe a lot of that stuff. It just looks very different right now. And even if it's not true in the sense of scientific data, it's still a story that gives me so much meaning, right? I mean, are the Lord of the Rings factual historical evidence? No. But are they true? Yeah. Right? Like in the stories that they tell a true story about the human condition. So we have to think about things like that, right? And no one, no matter how data driven, no matter how objective they claim to be, we're all people who do things that are human. And so I agree, it's important not to dehumanize these people who believe this stuff, because it gives them a lot of meaning, even though it's doing a lot of damage. Now you asked the question, how did I get out of it? Honestly, I didn't. I just went deeper. I'm more radical of a Christian now than I've ever been, my friend. That's the secret. Now, some people leave the faith completely. No judgment from me at all. I totally understand. But for me, all of my suspicions were not, oh, I don't believe this. It was, wait, I believe this so much. I see that you don't believe it enough. You're the one who won't take the command to love your enemies seriously. You're the one building new crosses for your enemies, not me. You're the ones who aren't feeding the poor or feeding the hungry or healing the sick. It's not me that's not doing that. It's you. And that's why I would bet, Kris, that at Reawaken, you've probably heard very few quotes from Jesus himself. You probably heard very few quotes from the quote-unquote red letters. Those are the words that Jesus says, allegedly anyway, in the 4 gospel accounts. I would guarantee there weren't many quotes, because if you read the Beatitudes, they fly in the face of every single fucking thing that Trump and MAGA stands for. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the merciful. The first shall be last. The last shall be first. This idea of a world that flips empire on its head is incredibly compelling to me. Do I think that means that one day a castle in the sky is going to float down from heaven? No. But does it mean that I can participate in this idea of a God that wants to work with creation to make the world a better and better place? That advocates for economic injustice, which is all throughout the scriptures. Yeah. And even if God isn't real, that story gives me a lot of truth and meaning. So for me, that's how I got there. That's why I'm still compelled by this Jesus character. I'm compelled by 2,000 years of complicated church history, some really shitty, Constantine era, Empire era Christianity, anti-Semitic Christianity that we see today, but also rebellious, anti-empire, Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights, justice-oriented, abolish slavery, goddammit, Christianity, right? So that's what I tell people is like, look, I'm not saying you have to convert to be a Christian. I don't believe in heaven and hell the same way anymore. It's not about that for me. But I do believe that you can use the Bible and Christianity as a tool for liberation or as a weapon of oppression. And as long as I'm going to follow Jesus, I'm going to use it as a tool for liberation every step of the way.
All right, so I could hold you here forever if you would allow me, but I know I have to let you go.
And I do want to be here forever, to be clear, but Chick-fil-A is calling my name, so you know.
So I've got 2 questions, and I'll try to keep them short.
Sure.
Name of the show is On Offense.
Yep.
How is it that our listeners can go on offense, can impose costs on Christian nationalism, those who are promoting it, the forces behind it, in a way that's productive and as safe as can be?
Yeah. Everyone's different. Everyone has different abilities. Maybe for you, it's just posting something on social media about ICE and what they're doing, knowing that your parents are going to give you shit for it. Maybe that's step 1 for you. You just get bold about what the hell's happening. That's one thing. Maybe you're really intrigued by everything I said. There's tons of books you can read. Jesus and John Wayne by Kris and Dumais, The Violent Taken by Force, whatever. There's tons that you can read just to educate yourself. And you could do even simpler things, like maybe you get more involved in your kid's school. Maybe you just commit to raising empathetic rebels who insist on a world where all of our neighbors are flourishing, not just some of them, right? Maybe that's your thing, is these kids are going to love all their neighbors, no freaking exceptions, right? So I would just say, think about, how do we make a world where all of our neighbors are flourishing, and what can you do in your local community or in your family or wherever to make that possible? I would just boil it down to that.
Tim Whitaker, thank you for coming on. Please let our audience know where they can find you, how they can support your work, and how they can learn more from you.
Sure. Well, if folks out there are Christian and trying to find a better path forward in faith, I recommend the New Evangelicals. It's a nonprofit, tons of content. I host a podcast there full of biblical scholars, the real deep shit. And I co-host a show called the Tim and April Show that goes live every Thursday at 12. Unpacking Christian Nationalism. My personal work is at Tim Whitaker Speaks. I write on Substack. I post on YouTube. You can always buy me a coffee. It always helps, or become a paid subscriber on Substack. Nothing I do is paywalled, so it's all available. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Brother, thank you so much. I hope to have you back soon, do some lives so we don't have to do the whole official podcast thing. I have so much to learn from you. I imagine that the people listening to this podcast were trying to keep up with the ping-ponging, and I apologize for that. But there's just so much about this that I don't know, and it's really just. I thank you. I'm so thankful to speak to an expert on something that is so fucking interesting and also really fucking dangerous.
Yes to both. I get it. Thanks for having me. And you're doing amazing work. And I want to learn more about what you do at some point. We'll get you on my channel, have a good conversation on the deep dive stuff that you do. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, brother. Christian nationalism isn't about faith. It's not about belief in God or a greater good. Christian nationalism is about power, about identity. It's about how people's desire for belonging and purpose can be used to radicalize them. Not just to hate, but to dehumanize, to silence, to destroy. You don't have to be religious to understand how powerful or dangerous this movement is. And you don't have to abandon your faith to fight against it. But you do have to fight against it, because neutrality makes you a target. Tim Whitaker and the New Evangelicals are doing holy work, calling bullshit on the grifters and extremists who are hijacking Christianity for authoritarian ends. And if you want to learn more about Christian nationalism and how to fight against it, go follow Tim's work, support it, share it. And I'll have the links in my show notes wherever you're listening to or watching this. I'm Kris Goldsmith, and On Offense is produced for Valor Media Network. And if you're ready to get organized, go to weareonoffense.com and make sure that you're signed up. There you'll find tools for launching an anti-fascist book club and all of the other guides for organizing and staying safe that I've written. That way, you're not just consuming content, you're building community. This is the moment for us to go on offense against Christian nationalism, against authoritarianism, and against despair. Stay safe, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.